So good afternoon. I wanted to welcome you all to Witness and Grace, our conversation about nuns and nuns. My name is Gail D. George, and I'm the editor of Global Sisters Report. And we have a wonderful crowd this afternoon. We have about more than 900 people who registered. So thank you all for your interest. And before we begin, I want to make a few housekeeping announcements. You may note that you were muted upon entry. We mute everyone as they enter, so it minimizes the background noise and distractions. So we ask that you please keep the mute on. I wanted to thank our colleagues at National Catholic Reporter, Lori Krupp, and so many others who are working behind the scenes. If you have any difficulties during the Zoom session, please send a message to the chat room. One of our team members will see then if they can help you out. So finally, you'll receive an email from us that will include resources that are mentioned today, and it'll have a video of the presentation. So don't worry if you didn't catch something, you'll be able to get it in the follow-up email. So I wanted now to introduce my colleague and just a really wonderful, fun person to work with, Soli Salgado, who is our facilitator today. Soli joined Global Sisters Report as a staff writer in February 2016 after a year as an intern at National Catholic Reporter. She often reports on issues involving migration and immigration and human trafficking, and she's reported from 10 countries for Global Sisters Report. Soli's energy and enthusiasm for stories is notable. I remember when she was reporting on her first stories about nuns and nuns, she came to us and said, you know, I don't think this is just an assignment. I think it's a beat, which means it's an area of focused coverage. And so indeed, she's turned it into such, and she's done several stories about nuns and nuns and this remarkable relationship between women, religious, and young people, and has received an award from the Associated Church Press for that coverage. So now I'm going to turn it over to Soli to introduce our guests.
Thank you. I'm so excited for this conversation. Today we'll be exploring Nuns and Nones with Annmarie Sanders and Brittany Koteles, so we'll be getting both sides of that relationship. Annmarie Sanders is a sister servant of the Immaculate Heart of Mary in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and she serves as the Director of Communications for the Leadership Conference of Women Religious. And before that, she was a medical social worker, so we're excited to have Sister Annmarie. And we also have Brittany Koteles, who serves on the leadership team of Nuns and Nones from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And before that, she led the U.S. Fellowship Program for Ashoka, a global network of social entrepreneurs. So welcome to you both. I'm so excited to pick your brains and dive into this. Both have been with Nuns and Nones since its beginnings, so I'm excited for them to share their perspectives and their experiences with all of you. So before we start, I'll turn us over to Brittany, and she'll open us with a prayer.
Thank you, Soli, and thank you to the GSR staff for inviting us here. So I want to call in Mary Oliver's words here. I do not know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention. So I'll say a couple words about these two quotes, and then I'll just open, as Mary teaches us of prayer, invite us into a moment of attentiveness to this conversation, all of us. My friend and one of the Nuns and Nones co-founders, Katie Gordon, is living with the Benedictine sisters in Erie, Pennsylvania, and she discovered this quote on a 1980s vocation brochure about monastic values, that women come to this community to seek God, which means simply they want to be transformed into love. And so as we enter this conversation, all of us, I do believe that something beautiful and new is opening in the monastic tradition and in the tradition of religious life. And I believe that each one of us is playing our part in tending that story. And so I just invite us to really pay attention to this moment in history. And so let us just take a breath in and out. as listeners and all askers of questions, may we bring our deep attentiveness into this conversation and to this blessed work in the world. And welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Brittany. That was beautiful and appropriate for our conversation. So that's great. I'll just tell everyone here, I'm so excited for this conversation, mainly because as a reporter, the hardest part about writing about nuns and nuns is like picking the best quotes when the conversations are just so rich. So I'm excited. We'll just have a fun little stream of consciousness chat on this movement. But let's go to the genesis story of Nuns and Nones. Brittany, why don't you take us to the beginning, how these two groups, the millennials and sisters, found each other, and walk us through how it's grown since then.
Yeah, thanks, Sully. So Nuns and Nones in so many ways is a story of finding each other. And I, and each of us have found someone or something connected to this web of encounter. In late 2016, this web began to weave actually in two different places. Adam Horowitz and Wayne Mueller embarked on an experiment to bring together sisters and seekers, first in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Annmarie, were you at that first gathering?
No.
I wasn't either. And from what I hear of that gathering and what I've heard of so many of these encounters of bringing women religious together with spiritually diverse young artists, activists, community builders who really care about spirituality and community and belonging and social justice, what happens when you bring these two groups of people together? And out of that inquiry was a lot of magic. Delight is a word that I often hear in these encounters, and kind of this delight in discovering so much in common. And meanwhile, Katie Gordon, in her home place of Grand Rapids at the time, was bringing together the sisters and seekers that she knew in Grand Rapids. And Adam and Katie and Wayne all found each other at some point, and more of these gatherings were hosted in 5 more cities across the country. And so we really began in this mold of curating encounters between these two unlikely groups, was like one of the kind of, yeah, Sully, you're nodding, you've written that line too, probably. And I feel like, that was, it'll be 5 years this fall. And in these 5 years, I feel like what has evolved and deepened with Nuns and Nones is, beyond just the gathering and encounter of two groups, we exist as a space for people on the edges of either inside or outside religious tradition to come together, to be in community and learning together, and to do the work of healing the world together. And that has been through experiments like a 6-month residency at Mercy Center in Burlingame. But it continues to evolve. And so myself and our teammates and our circle of organizers, we're still living into what Nuns and Nones is becoming. But what I assure you is it's becoming a community of people who are tending to the infrastructure of spiritual community that we will always need to do the work of healing the world.
And you mentioned earlier that like when we were talking about how it went from these like local meetups and conversations and it's become more expansive. Can you talk a little bit about like the actual logistics of, what it was in the beginning and how things are organized now, for either Annmarie or Brittany, whoever wants to answer?
Yeah, I can take a crack, and then Annmarie, I'd love to hear your kind of perspective on it. So our local groups still exist, and that is how we began. And what that looks like is, when I lived in DC, we were a group of Annmarie. That's an important piece of context too, is that before I moved to Milwaukee, where I now live, Annmarie and I were part of the same Nuns and Nones group in Washington, DC. And I was one of the local organizers there. So there were a few of us who, just tended to curating, maybe a monthly gathering. And we would dive deep on, some kind of topic or theme. In some seasons, in other seasons, we might be doing more. Like there's been work around the election that happened in November. So sometimes it's more with our hands, sometimes more with our hearts and spirits, but that's kind of what a local group looks like. There's a lot of ownership and leadership from our local organizers who do an amazing job just creating that space of encounter. And then beyond that, right now, we've done, I think we're still growing into like, what is the kind of sandbox for these kinds of collaborations? In the last year, different kind of experiments done by or with Nuns and Nones have been 200 of us signed up to take a regenerative economy course offered by Movement Generation, which is an amazing movement organization that focuses mostly on climate justice and a just transition out of an extractive economy. So during the pandemic over the summer, we had 200 sisters and seekers taking the same class together, gathering in between classes in prayer and reflection to not just to be in prayer and reflection, and also to be in practical discernment about what is needed, what kind of leadership and action is needed to move beyond an extractive economy. So that's one example, but I think I'll stop there. I could give others, but I think we exist to support those kinds of experiments in community building.
Annmarie, did you want to add anything about the actual organization or evolution of the group?
I think Brittany did a great job. Nothing more to add to it.
Yeah, well, I'm really curious about, for both of you, I'll start with Annmarie here. So Brittany mentioned how, and I'll also add, I think as like a spiritually seeking millennial who writes for Global Sisters Report, to me, the attraction is clear to sisters in terms of like, you can learn contemplation and community building and social justice activism and all of that. But I'm also would love to hear about what sisters get out of it, because I know a lot of times it's so easy to describe Nuns and Nones as like a one-way street. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what drew you to Nuns and Nones and how it's enriched your either connection to like another generation or what you've learned from it?
Oh, sure. Thanks, Sully. Yeah, so my connection with Nuns and Nones is kind of on two levels. My first experience was to be invited to a convening back in 2018, early 2018, of a group that wanted to look at, how's this organization going, or how's this alliance moving forward? And that was my first time meeting the millennials who were part of this, and from all over the country, men and women who, consider themselves social activists, but we're seeking for that spiritual grounding in their lives. And as soon as I heard them, I was there with them. I resonated completely with their hopes for the world and what they really valued. And then I heard sisters who were at this convening also talking about, what it meant for them to have these new relationships with younger people on that same journey. So that was a wonderful introduction that just whetted my appetite. So when I heard there was a local group starting in DC under the great leadership of Brittany, I knew I wanted to be a part of that. And now I'm also part of the advisory council for Nuns and Nones. So I kind of see it from the local level and the national level, and just see such wonderful benefits in the organization. for sisters, of course. I think one of the things that has delighted me is to see that there's like a growing mutuality in this relationship, that, even if at first it was said that the two groups embarking on this, that it was a mutual relationship, I think in the beginning there was a sense that, sisters had some insights about the way forward. And that's true, and I certainly know that there's a great respect and appreciation for the wisdom that sisters bring to these conversations. But we are living what that younger generation wants for their own lives. We live in communities of contemplation. Our lives are grounded in a deep spirituality. We're focused on responding to the needs of the world and situations of injustice. And so I hear the seekers saying, well, tell us how this works. How can we do this ourselves? Right, Brittany? Isn't that the question over and over? Tell us. But what I'm watching is that seekers are finding their own voice, and their own place on the journey, and trusting their own insights and wisdom. I think they're discovering how their experiences have so much to offer us as sisters. And I know my own world has just been stretched, thinking in new ways, reading new things, open to new questions, new ways of repairing the world. So that movement to real mutuality has really been a privilege to behold and be part of. And I think one of the other advantages for sisters, or benefits from this, is like that expansion of focus that I see taking place in Nuns and Nones, that I think Brittany and her core team have just they've already realized that the work of creating a more just world can be utterly exhausting. And we know that community, and they know that community and spiritual grounding are essential if they're going to be doing this work for the long haul. And it's key. That long haul, that long commitment is really key to making an impact. So I see the ways that they're exploring the critical issues of the day, the ways of being community, the avenues of spiritual grounding that go beyond the world of Catholic sisters, as being so enriching to us. They're drawing upon resources that come from so many spiritual traditions, and are connecting with other organizations working on the repair of the world. So I think we are benefiting from that broad exploration, because it stretches us. And through Brittany's prompting, the prompting of her companions, we're looking at all kinds of new questions about how we use our assets and our land, our property, our buildings, our personnel, our spiritual formation, in ways that we've never would have considered before.
Brittany, why don't you tell us a little about your religious background, and what drew you to Nuns and Nones, or what's kept you in Nuns and Nones now that it's been several years?
Yeah, thank you. So I grew up Catholic in my early years, and we didn't have a very strong connection to the practice. It was like, I went to CCD and I loved playing on the Holy Family basketball team. Later in my kind of high school and college years, I gravitated toward Evangelical Christianity. I think I was just very taken by this very approachable image of God and the divine, and like Jesus with a rock band was really compelling to me, as a very like emotive and like at my core seeker. I was just like born to yearn for the sacred in the world, and that was an amazing outlet. And I say I had an amicable breakup with Christianity in my college years, but have always returned to the question of the deeper questions about why we're here and what our duty is in this life. And, you know, have been working in the nonprofit kind of world my entire adulthood, and in the work of supporting usually nonprofit founders through a fellowship for social innovators. I always returned to like just noticing that there were just as many kind of big, deep questions about how to hold this work of repairing the world and like the bigger search as there were about strategy. And it was, my job was as much about creating the space for the former. So I would joke that I'm a secular chaplain in a nonprofit, and but that had great truth to it. And yeah, so my entire career in a way has been just centered around how do we create space to support the spiritual leaders of our time who are not doing their spiritual leadership inside a religion. And very soon into that work, realized I don't want to touch it without elders and wisdom traditions holding us and being a part of this conversation. So yeah, that's how I came to Nuns and Nones. Yeah, I think I'll stop there. I can say more, but yeah.
Yeah, well, let's go to like who you both think Nuns and Nones is for, because I know some people prefer the term sisters and seekers because sisters prefer sisters over nuns, and nuns, N-O-N-E-S, is a little reductive for the spectrum of people involved in this. So, you know, who do you think Nuns and Nones is for, if you were to your elevator pitch, I guess?
Is this for me or both of us?
We can start with you and then Annmarie.
Okay. So, I mean, I think Nuns and Nones is for people who feel called to committed community, who see that given what's going on in the world, it is impossible to live into a kind of way of life that is sustainable, that is not colluding with the kind of extractive systems that we have right now. Like, you can't do that alone. And it's really hard to do that without being rooted in a deeper way of understanding our lives and our commitments. And so I just see, I mean, yeah, we kind of sometimes joke in our team about changing our name to ampersand because it's really not about these two groups. It's about a deeper impulse that we're seeing these two groups gravitate toward, which is about tending again to the structures of commitment and community that I just deeply believe are needed to build the world that we want. And these are two groups that are really out in the front, tending some of those questions.
Can you also speak a little bit to the spiritual diversity? I know you mentioned like one of the founders is Jewish, and how some people are like super atheist and some are still Catholic, and how where the overlap is there in those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is when people talk about the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, people often have this image of like, yeah, religiously unaffiliated is the explanation of that. And it really is a misnomer, because it's not actually about none of the above. It's more like all of the above, or some of the above, or why the check boxes. This is about, heeding a spiritual call and being spiritual seekers. And that transcends institution. That has nothing to do with your affiliation. So, yeah, Nuns and Nones is like, there's a lot of playfulness in that name, and it's helpful shorthand. And there are the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, is a bit of a misnomer, I think. everyone who's gravitated to this space is a true seeker in their own right.
Well, it makes a great headline, I can say that.
Yeah.
Annmarie, do you want to talk about like what kinds of sisters have been involved in that, or maybe what kind of sister might be drawn to Nuns and Nones?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's really noteworthy to think that Nuns and Nones sprung up at a time in U.S. religious life where we're experiencing both the pain of so much loss, and yet we're also standing at the edge of something very new for religious life. And just to speak a little bit about that pain, the great women who entered our communities after World War II in very, very large numbers, so different than today. People came in groups of 50 or 100 or 200 a year. Those women are now, they've either completed their lives or they're near the end of their life. And while we've known for years that we'd be losing large numbers of sisters through death, it's another thing to actually experience it. We become so close to one another as sisters that the loss of any member is felt so deeply. And absorbing those large numbers of deaths is very, very challenging. Coupled with that, we're letting go of ministries that, were so precious to us for years. And then we have some communities that are actually coming to their end, they're completing their mission. So coupled with that grief is this other, reality that we're at a very exciting time. We're at a point where we're now asking, what will our small numbers call us to be in a world that was different when we were very big and very visible in society? What can we do now that we're not tied to big institutions that we had to administer and staff? What do we do with this new freedom to serve? And isn't it kind of amazing that at this time when we could be tempted to wonder, is there still a value in religious life anymore? That Brittany and the others have come into our lives saying, like, are you kidding? There's enormous value in religious life, and we want to be with you. We want to walk with you. We want to explore the spiritual life with you. We want to work to repair the world with you. And we feel if we did this with you, it would be so much richer. So to listen to what the millennials are envisioning for a future that partners us in some way, where we perhaps help them build the foundation and support that they need to do the work of repairing the world, I think gives us as sisters kind of a new reason for existing, a very tangible way to impact the world. So the long answer to your question about who's this for, I think it's for any woman religious who wants to be part of an exploration of a religious life for the future. And it's a religious life that may not look a whole lot like the one that's been in existence for centuries. Maybe it will contain some of the elements of the past, but it probably will be much more expansive and inclusive of others. So I think we sisters will be enormously stretched by the questions and vision of our younger companions. And really from what I've experienced thus far, the journey can be a whole lot more fun and joyful and rich and interesting with these companions.
Yeah, I mean, I know at least from my perspective, reporting on Nuns and Nones has been actually really instrumental in my own education on religious life, mainly because, the concept of charism. So for those of you who don't know, a charism is like the founding mission of a congregation, and it might be tending to the sick or orphans or education. And I know in my reporting, one of the sisters said, this might be a new vehicle for people to inherit charisms as our congregations close, or I believe it's the Dominican charism that's like responding to the needs of the time, and the needs now are probably more around community and spirituality. And I've been just so grateful for getting to report on Nuns and Nones because it's helped me expand my concept of religious life and charisms and all that. So I'll just flip that to both of you. What's something that you have learned through Nuns and Nones, whether it's about your own spirituality or about the world, any major takeaway that you've gained through your conversations and relationships. Brittany, we can start with you if you're ready.
Oh, ready, solely. Well, you talked about inheriting charism. I think also inheriting or being in our own kind of formation around what a committed life looks like. Because, so I remember one time I was in a conversation with Sister Julie Vieira, an IHM sister in Monroe, an amazing Gen X sister, because Gen X and millennial sisters are hugely tending the future of religious life as well. And Julie taught me in a conversation, we were kind of joking and playing around with what ordination would look like for people outside of religious traditions. And Julie said, you know, when you have these moments where someone says something that to them is totally off the cuff and ends up changing the way that you think. Julie was like, well, I think you're talking more about a profession of vows than ordination. And I was like, well, I don't know what you're talking about. And she was like, well, ordination is like you are being invested, like power is being vested in you by an institution. But, you know, sisters, we take vows. We are publicly witnessed in our commitments, and we are held accountable to a way of life by our community. And I was kind of blown away by that. And I think that in general, our generation's leadership has a lot to do with redefining and redrawing the boundaries of relationship to institution, which is a good thing in a lot of ways. And with that has come our muscle and our skill of commitment has atrophied a little bit. And to be in relationship with sisters who have taken vows to a specific way of living. I mean, you want to talk about what I've learned alone from the vow of poverty. You know, some sister, I remember Sister Judy Carl laughing about the pre-Vatican II days when you would say, I'm not sure there are many sisters on this call who, if you had a pencil, you wouldn't say my pencil, you would say a pencil of my use. And like, let's stop for a second and actually think about what that means. At a time when literally the privatization and concentration of wealth and power and ownership is causing us to have a planetary crisis and a crisis of spirit, to be connected to women whose language of ownership and have taken such a discerned approach to what the concept of ownership, to relinquishing ownership and to being about common ownership as a life commitment. There is a lot that we can learn about that. And I think that, you know, inside and outside of Catholic religious life, that vow and those kinds of commitments are necessary if we're going to figure out how to live in a sustainable way. So I could talk for hours just about what I carry with me about the vows and the model of commitment that I think we can learn into, but I'll stop there.
Annmarie, go ahead.
Yeah, I too have learned so much, but to pick up from what Brittany was saying about, you know, her understanding of the vows, I watch with a lot of curiosity how you, Brittany, and some of the others combine tradition and innovation. And I think you treat tradition with a great reverence, and you have a capacity to draw out of the tradition the essence of what's good and maybe reimagine it in new ways. I see that with your spiritual practices, you know, with your interest in something like the vows, and with the really keen questions you bring to why we do what we do. And I actually wrote something down that Brittany wrote in an article that was, I think, published just yesterday. in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. And it was this, if I can read it. Most innovations are ancient ideas looking for new soil. The real task of social innovators is to learn how to tend old seeds in new ways. So I really think that's what you're showing us how to do. So that's something really important that I've learned. I'd say some of the other things that have really impacted me are around areas of spirituality, particularly as a basis for what sustains the work we do in the world. And I've been very touched by how strongly Brittany and others value the spiritual formation that we sisters just take for granted. You know, we've been given at least 3 years of our lives just to our spiritual formation. It makes me think about that in whole new ways. So I think, you know, the millennials see a contemplative spiritual formation that grounds us for how we want to be in the world as equally important to a professional education. And that's pretty radical. So I think your valuing of that makes me want to be even more intentional about my own ongoing spiritual formation. And it makes me think about the formation we provide to our newer members just joining us, because the work ahead of them to repair the world will be enormously challenging. And you know, how do we assure that they have the foundations that are strong enough to carry them through? And I just want to say this too, that a great gift that I've received from the seekers whom I've known is insights about how to live in the world in an unrushed, thoughtful way. So I've been very interested in your own attraction to monasticism. And, you know, monasticism not lived in isolated centers, but lived right in the heart of life. And, you know, centers where people can come to really nurture that spiritual impulse and not be caught in the frenetic pace of life. That can be even more frenetic for those of us who have a social activist bent within us. So I'm fascinated by how you're figuring out how to live in a slower, thoughtful way that's highly appreciative of life and all of its beauty and all of its gifts, and grounds you for your work.
Annmarie, I also want to circle back to just something you mentioned earlier about nuns and nuns being maybe an outlet for grief, or the grief that sisters are feeling, and how nuns and nuns, you know, helps provide perspective on that. I wanted to ask both of you what Nuns and Nones has meant for you during the pandemic. I know sisters are really big on meaning making, and so I'm curious how this has helped in that, if it's also been a way to ward off isolation, or if it's been that outlet of grief, just this past year, let's just say. So either one of you wants to kick that off.
I could start a little bit with that. So some of my contact with the seekers has been, of course, virtual during this time, and I've really appreciated their insights on how to live with attention and intention. And I think my congregation was lucky enough to be exposed to that in a larger way when Brittany and two of her companions from the core team of Nuns and Nones, Katie Gordon and Adam Horowitz, spent a day with my community virtually. We called it a retreat day. They called it Through the Portal Together, Repair and Radical Imagination. So it was a wonderful way to spend a day together in the difficult pandemic time. And really through their very creative processes, they helped us to look back on our past and say, you know, what did we do to sustain the world? Or what did we do to sustain ourselves and our work to repair the world? And what can we carry forward from that past to help us imagine new ways of doing the work of repair into the future? And really through their excellent presentations and content, and very creative and gentle and tender way of leading us in processes throughout the day, it awakened in us such energy and hope for the future, and like encouraged us to name our dreams and passions. So that was a wonderful way for us to deal with some of the grief of this time, kind of channel it towards something so needed for the future. And I think for us, it helped us to see what a relationship with a younger generation can really awaken in us. And I think it calls us to be the best we can be, because we want to be all we can be to help nurture the generations coming after us.
Brittany, did you want to add anything to that question?
I just shared the reason why Katie, Adam, and I, who I believe are on this call, named that retreat day Through the Portal was based on the words of Arundhati Roy. She wrote an article about the pandemic as a portal, that historically pandemics have forced a reckoning. And she said, we can choose to walk through this portal, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. And that's, for me, the space that Nuns and Nones became in the pandemic was actually, it opened up with this like restlessness in me. Like, it's time. We're out of time. And we need to be smarter and more committed to each other and more discerning. And like, it is time to like talk about the Dominican charism, like read the signs of the time, to learn how to see honestly what's happening in our world right now, and to listen for the just and loving way of living our lives, and to align everything. It is time to align everything in service of that. We're not in a good place right now. And that is the monastic way of living. Like, that is it. We all have it. It is about aligning your life in service of life. And so for me, Nuns and Nones actually became the space of like, it's time to really get clear about what we need to do. And and model a different way of living that transcends the kind of campaign politics, like, which is important, but there's a deeper listening that we need to cultivate if the work we're doing to organize on the ground is going to have the power that it needs.
We actually have a question from the audience that touches on this theme. So you both have been speaking like the phrase repairing the world, or the work of repairing the world. What does that mean to you? And how does Nuns and Nones help in that? When you talk about repairing, is it like, literally the environment, or is it this spiritual work? How are you using that phrase?
When I'm saying a different way of living?
More like when you talk about like repairing the world.
Repairing the world. Yeah. Okay. So, if we look at any kind of factor, I think climate wise is just like where our environment is right now, like the fact that we live in a world where it's okay for companies to keep burning fossil fuels to make money in a world where the racial wealth gap is what it is, where 60% of Americans can't access $400 if they're in an emergency. Like, that's the world that we're living in. And I think when I talk about a different way of living, it's we can't actually fight that fire with more fire and just transactionally win our world back. If we're going to organize, like, we actually need to rewire how we are living, and whether or not we are practicing the redistribution of resources, the relationship with land and the living world. Are we actually walking out of the kinds of structures that keep making it okay for these things to happen? And so for me, and this is kind of where Annmarie, you mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, like thinking differently about land use, or, you know, I really believe that there's an embodiment of that kind, like of a kind of spirituality that honors all life through the choices that we make in what are we doing with our wealth of land, relationship, money, power, connections. Like that is living toward a world where those resources are shared and that we are back in connection with the web of all life. And that has been, and sorry, Soli, I'm kind of tangenting off your question, but I think it's so amazing. It's been this like kind of surprising blossom of work from Nuns and Nones is engaging more deeply with sisters about questions like land. And it's like, we're moving toward more of an ecological sort of spirituality. And here's this opportunity to, in relationship, really think about and get outside of the regular expectations, go against the grain for how are we thinking about the future of our lands and, or the future of my own money in my bank account. Like there's such an embodied kind of praxis in those questions. And I think Nuns and Nones is going to go deeper in that direction together. So it's marrying, you know, the kind of spiritual sensibility of the sacredness of all life with like really in this like kind of emergency point of the human story, how do we live that out when the deck is stacked against us? I hope I answered your question.
Oh yeah, Annmarie, did you have anything? Because you also mentioned that phrase. So did you want to build on anything Brittany said?
Brittany did a great job. I think I would just simply say, you know, just the definition of the word repair itself, it's, you know, trying to mend or heal something that's suffering. So I think it's just that we see the suffering of the world so clearly that how can we be led to do anything else but work to repair it?
Great. Well, here's another question that I am really curious about your answers here. Someone asked, what advice do you have in beginning conversations on death, spiritual death, congregational completion, young adult deaths, life shifts? Basically, I remember, at least in the beginning, one of the sisters said that how these conversations begin isn't usually in like, what do you believe? And let's see where it lines up. It's a lot broader. And it's like, what's in your heart? Talk about, yeah, if you have any practical advice or anecdotes on your own experience on bridging that spiritual gap so that you do find that common ground more fluidly. We can start, Annmarie, if you want to go.
Well, I think one thing that I love about this alliance is that nobody's expected to have any answers, and no question, there is no question that can't be brought to the table. So I think just being able to talk about any of those big complex issues with honesty, to be in the questions together, that for me is where I find life. So I think to begin any of those difficult conversations, talk about your own experience, talk about how you feel, talk about what stirs your heart or what makes your heart soar in any of that, and listen to one another. I think if we come at those conversations, not seeking answers, but just enjoying the questions and letting the questions lead us and teach us, it'll be a wonderful thing.
Brittany, do you want to add?
I would agree. I think in DC, when we started our group, the first question, like the getting to know you question, was what is one and I think that this was used in other Nuns and Nones gatherings too. This might be an Adam Horowitz question. What is one wild wondering of your heart? So we're not really about small talk, which is kind of the point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Although we also just have a lot of fun together. Yeah.
So, one other question here. It says, in relation to the local chapters of Nuns and Nones, the speakers mentioned that there was shared ownership and leadership with a group of sisters and young adults that create the space of encounter. How do you empower that ownership and leadership to begin a group of community seekers?
That's a beautiful question. I think we're still learning. I think one thing that we can do to support that is just the clarity of invitation. Like, how do we, make the invitation clear enough that people know what the first step to take is. And I also think, we're learning a lot. We're a young organization that is trying to support, like decentralized leadership of these groups forming. And I think we're also learning like how hands-on or how hands-off to be, because creating resources or, themes for conversations is often very orienting. So I think it's walking that balance of direction and empowerment.
Annmarie, did you want to say anything or?
Nothing, except Brittany is a wonderful role model for that, because she's more than capable of leading a group herself, but is very invitational to other seekers, other sisters to join with her. And I think that's part of the power of the alliance, that all of that is so shared. So it's a wonderful witness to the world.
Yeah, we have some amazing local organizers. Our New York City group has been holding open digital gatherings weekly or bi-weekly for over 52 weeks straight since the pandemic started, and they've opened it to whoever wants to come. And that's, I think it's also being open enough to let those local examples influence us, right? That there should be mutuality in that conversation too. And we're trying to learn how to do that, how to be influenced by the work that's, the conversations that are happening on the ground, and allow ourselves to be transformed by that.
Well, before we wrap, I want to touch on the fact that I know one of the articles I wrote was about how Nuns and Nones, how like sisters have affected the activism of young people. So we've talked a lot about like the spiritual conversations and like the huge universal questions. But I'm curious if either of you want to talk to how activism has been born out of this, whether it's some sort of partnership or if it's just like a sharing of resources, or let's touch on the social justice part of this alliance. If either of you have like an experience, whether protesting together or just organizational groundwork that you want to mention, and if not, that's okay too.
Yeah, I mean, the first time I was arrested, I was with sisters. I spent election day rolling around Milwaukee, Kenosha, and Racine with 30 women religious who, if there are any Racine Dominicans, Milwaukee SSNDs on this call, like these are women who like are living with and in community with one of the most at-risk populations in a pandemic. And they created a way to discern and safely go out to polling places that were flagged for potential voter discrimination, just to be a prayerful presence and to be visible in saying, sisters are here, and we're here for voters. And we want you to be able to vote safely. But I think the other thing is solely, talking about, if we zoom out and look at, the larger movement for climate justice right now, we don't have the long-term structures of belonging. Like, if you think about it, religious affiliation has gone down at about the same rate that in the 70s, nonprofit infrastructure moved up. Okay, so we have a movement that is very adept at running organizations and having really good strategy, but we are not doing this work as though we will know one another when we're 80 years old. And that is a problem for the strategy of this work and for the long-term longevity of this work. So I think that has changed my thinking, and I'm really seeing and listening for what is the gift of Nuns and Nones actually to movement infrastructure, and how we think about committed community as a part of that, because it's strategically necessary. And then the last thing I would say is this embodied piece of, like, it's not actually all about going out there and shaking our fists. It's about modeling different choices with our land, with our wealth of resource, with our spirituality. And so I think that's something, again, that is just kind of like concretely, there's like talking to communities who are saying, should we sell this land? Should we do something else? And we didn't evolve to be a land consultation crew, and we don't come at it that way. It's a spiritual question. And so I'm kind of amazed and so curious to see we're in a planetary crisis of climate change, and what would it actually look like if large, like the bigger story of what religious people and people of spirit are deciding to do with the resources that they have. That can change a lot.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who sent really amazing questions that I'm so bummed we don't have time to get to, but I may be pocketing them for my own interviews in the future. So maybe you'll find the answer in a future article. We'll see. But in terms of, just a follow-up email, if any of you are interested in getting involved, we'll email all of you who have registered here some information, as well as previous articles that we've written about Nuns and Nones if you want more background on activism. And someone asked about the residency program and them living together. We've written on that. So you'll have all that information sent to you. Brittany and Annmarie, thank you so much for this conversation. I could listen to you guys all day. I feel so spoiled in GSR getting to cover this beat. So thank you so much for sharing your perspectives and experiences with this. I'll turn us over to my editor, Gail DeGeorge, before closing here.
Well, thanks, Zoe. Thank you, Annmarie. Thank you, Brittany. What a wonderful conversation we have had this afternoon. Really, really appreciate it. And Zoe, you were so right when you came to us and said, this is a beat. This isn't just a story. So thank you for this opportunity to really be a witness to this burgeoning and wonderful relationship that's growing and indeed promises to help change and influence us in our world in such positive ways. So again, thank you. And I guess we're going to turn it over to Annmarie to lead us in a closing prayer and thought.
Sure. So I was asked to find a quote that we might end our time with together. And I chose this particular one because it speaks to me of what the Sisters and Seekers relationship is all about. The mutual seeking and how enjoyable that seeking can be when done with such fine companions. So let's just listen together to these words from Rachel Naomi Remen. Perhaps real wisdom lies not in not seeking answers at all. Any answer we find will not be true for long. An answer is a place where we can fall asleep as life moves past us to its next question. After all these years, I've begun to wonder if the secret of living well is not in having all the answers, but in pursuing unanswerable questions in good company. So let's just take a moment to remember gratefully and in silence the good company you have in your own life. And let's remember as well those who long for good company and cannot find it. And then let us pray together. Holy mystery, infinite divine, let us never take for granted the companions you provide us along the journey of life. May we cherish each one and treasure their connection with us. May we never stop pursuing unanswerable questions, because we know that contained within them are signs for how we may best help, heal, repair, and perhaps change the world. We ask all of this, trusting in your presence, that your presence will be with us, and that it's always full of surprise, tenderness, and love. Amen.
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 Thank you so much, Marie.
Thank you, Brittany.
I want to say, it has been, your companionship has been a gift. I'm really grateful.
For me as well. And thank you, Sully and Gail, for inviting this conversation.
Yes.
Oh, thank you so much for your time and thoughts.
Sully, such an amazing steward of the story of Nuns and Nones. Sully, love you.
You're gonna play a song?